Hey, welcome back to the video series. This is the third video. It's the last in this series. And through this video series, I hope now that you have a better understanding of the role of a coach who's trying to impact the speed of their players. I've shown you the difference between the content of sprinting and the context of sprinting, which I covered in video number 1. I made the argument that you should probably be responsible for both track speed and game speed because, let's face it, if your players are faster outside of the game but not inside the game, what's the point? I hope also that you now have a better understanding of how to organize your speed training around these two broad categories based upon the types of problems your players are challenged by. As a reminder, content problems, which exist in the clear and complicated domain, can be trained outside of the game, while context problems are better trained within the game. Now, if you understand these things, then great. I'm pretty happy you tuned in, but you might be asking, well, now what? You've given me some great insight into the complexities of speed, how the training should differ depending upon skill level, and even how my role might change through the process. But I'd like to know more. If I am to truly impact how my players play the game, then I think I need to know what you know. Tell me your secrets. Well, first, there's no secrets, right? And second, if you really do want to know more, if you're truly interested in both maximizing your own impact with the players you work with, as well as improving their speed of play in the game, then you really need to better understand your own role in the training process. So let's start there. Let's talk about when you need to be a director of training and when you need to be a facilitator. This is a very important distinction, so let's get right to it. Now, we can consider the role of the coach in a couple of different ways, each potentially leading to entirely different training experiences and outcomes. Coach as the center of the training experience is the traditional method of coaching and is no doubt still the predominant approach in the world today. The coach sets the objectives of the training session, the coach tells the players what to do, and the coach corrects the players when they are not doing what is expected in the way that is expected. This is coach as director. Coach as facilitator, on the other hand, means that the players are the center of the training process, and the coach acts to guide them towards the most appropriate choices. In the coach as facilitator training session, the system will tend to become more organized over time. It will tend to maintain structure, if it is well designed, without any external control, in this case, the directions of the coach. Now let's look at these two roles in a little bit more detail. Traditionally, coaches have adopted prescriptive and repetitive teaching approaches, where the coach directs athletes towards some idealized pattern of movement, providing feedback based upon any deviation from this preferred pattern. We see this in training all the time. An athlete executes a repetition of whatever. It comes back to the coach for some feedback, and which is generally along the lines of, blank was pretty good. Blank was pretty bad. Do blank in the next repetition. Now, the underlying assumptions behind such a method are twofold. Number one, there is an ideal technical model that is generalizable across the population. And number two, that athletes learn by repetitive, perfect practice, and any deviation from this shall be considered as error. This is a linear approach to learning where technique is practiced and mastered separately from the game. The question is, when is this appropriate? Is it appropriate? Well, one instance where such an approach might be of value is when we look to affect the content of movement. There might be times when we want to reduce or maybe even completely eliminate the information an athlete has to manage, so the athlete can have a pressure-free environment in which to connect with her body and how it moves. We feel that mechanics matter, and we feel it is pretty uncontroversial to state that mechanics are best addressed in a reasonably simple environment before adding complexity. We feel it is also pretty uncontroversial for a coach to sometimes help direct this process. Now, we must remember that the content of a movement is the foundation of the sporting skill in context. Without the underpinning physical abilities and technical stability, the skill has nothing to anchor itself to. Now, this is where the training of content comes in, where a coach directs the athlete to move in a way which respects both the basic biomechanical model as well as the individual expression of that model. Now, critics of such a content-first approach will suggest that this emphasis on the individual component parts of the system won't necessarily lead to an improvement in performance, that it develops technically sound players with poor decision-making skills. Now, these critics will argue that the manner in which an athlete moves is dictated by the information that arises in the game, and thus they will argue for a more functional systems approach to athletic development, where the technical and tactical demands are developed simultaneously in an open, sport-specific environment. An athlete's action, remember, is tightly coupled to their perception, and therefore any removal of information from the system affects the action. We learned in video 2 that sport is primarily a problem-solving process, and when we remove context from the movement, we eliminate the most relevant problems, and thus limit an athlete's progression. Proponents of a context-dominated, i.e. game-first approach, where the coach acts to facilitate learning rather than directing it, suggest a nonlinear approach is more appropriate, where perceptual, cognitive, and technical abilities are developed simultaneously. So what do we do? Well, our next step is to decide how to organize our training system. Do we direct our athletes, or do we facilitate the process? This requires that we first identify whether the athlete is context limited or content limited, whether their development is restricted by how they interact with game information or by their physical and technical abilities. In effect, we ask, do we start with the game or do we start with the athlete? Once we answer this question, it is simply a matter of organizing our training appropriately. Now, with respect to the development of any technical ability or skill, including speed, we encourage coaches to organize their training such that it becomes generally more representative over time, i.e. we move from content to context, from limited information to more information. Just understand that this is rarely a linear process, and we must expect backward steps and nonlinear breakthroughs along the way, and thus we must remain agile and responsive with our training prescription. In a very simple world, we might organize the training of acceleration for say an American football running back, for example, through this following sequence: wall drills, prowler pushes, heavy resisted 5-meter bursts, lightly resisted 10-meter bursts, 20-meter solo accelerations, 30-meter competitive accelerations, maybe against teammates, accelerations while they're carrying the football, accelerations from a handoff from the quarterback, accelerations responsive to the movement of a single player, accelerations responsive to the movement of multiple players, accelerations in a small-sided game, accelerations in a large-sided game. Now, we can also increase the experiential fidelity by performing any of these with equipment, say pads and a helmet. And then we've got almost unlimited number of options, right? Each of these tasks has varying degrees of organization and complexity. Each of them have varying degrees of transfer. Each will provide varying levels of task difficulty. All of them can potentially aid in improving the acceleration of the player you're working with. Which task you choose and how you organize it simply depends upon whether you start with the game, i.e., the context, or start with the athlete, i.e., the content. Now, if you start with the game, then your role is that of facilitator of context. If you start with the athlete, then your role is that of director of content. Now, I hope these videos have given you something to think about. More than that, I hope they have influenced how you coach speed in team sports. Because there's simply far too much bad information out there. Much of it is conflicting, it's biased, and self-serving even. We address this in the Altis Need for Speed course, and we try to present a balanced view of what speed is, why it's important in team sports, and how you can improve the speed of your players and teams. Now, there are people who complete this on-demand series, these 3 videos that we're just finishing up here, and they move forward with their coaching immediately. Then there are those who want to go a little deeper, who want to influence speed in their team sport athletes no matter what scenario they're faced with. They want training from the best in the world on this subject. They want help with maximizing the most of their coaching time. They want help safely training their athletes for peak performance. Now, if that's you, click on the button below and jump into the Need for Speed course. Beyond the invaluable reading, watching, you'll also get access to our Altis Agra Facebook group where you can get advice from other coaches just like you, and where we also have a course facilitator answering questions and helping you through each of the 3 books. Need for Speed is the resource for team sport coaches who want results. That's it. You won't have to go anywhere else. So click the button below and we'll see you in there. It's clear that the sport performance community was in need for a course like this. Everyone we spoke to was not only super encouraging, but many of them also offered their assistance to try to make this as great a resource as possible. Thanks for watching, and thanks for appreciating the Need for Speed.